Well, good afternoon, everyone. And happy 2013, right? I mean, here we are. Glad to see everybody here. My name is Reagan Wascom, and I will be one of the MCs for today's meeting. We're really glad to have a nice turnout for this first meeting around South Platte groundwater, specifically around House Bill 1278. And my job is to direct the Colorado Water Institute, where we were given the responsibility for conducting this study. So what I'd like to do first off is thank just a couple of folks. The South Platte Roundtable, I think it's important to mention that really today's meeting is the Groundwater Committee of the South Platte Roundtable. So we appreciate the Roundtable being willing to more or less step up and help us host these public meetings and to have some dialogue around groundwater in the basin. Thanks to the chair of the Groundwater Committee. If they get out of hand, you got the gavel, Joe, so you'll know what to do there. Here's our purpose today. We want to make sure as we conduct this study that the public is informed about what we're doing, how we're doing it. We want to hear from you. Try to be as transparent as we can. We want to do a little bit of education today, a little bit of discussion. We're going to model some public debate and dialogue, hopefully dialogue more than debate. And then we'll have some time to hear from you all as well. And so a couple of things I need to point you to before we get started. First off, outside, and I hope everybody got this, there is a fact sheet on the study, and I'll be bringing you up to date on that as well. But probably most importantly, there is a public input response form. And this is going to be part of our program today, so I really want to encourage you all to take a few minutes as you're listening and we're talking. Think about this and fill it out. And if you need one, and you don't have it, you could raise your hand right now, and I would be, somebody in the back would be happy to bring you one. So just raise your hand if you need a form. Otherwise, go ahead and what we're asking you to do is tell us what you're concerned about, what you're thinking about, what you think we need to preserve as we deal with the issues on the basin, what you'd like more information about. And yes, you'll get time for some questions as well if you want to do that. But we're asking you to write it down because we think it's probably unlikely that we'll get to hear from everybody in the room today that has something to say. And so our plan is to put these on our website so that folks can see what people are thinking, what the concerns are, and what they want us to consider as we do this study. You'll notice there's not a place to write your name down, so you're completely free to comment anonymously. If you want to put your name down, you may, but you certainly do not have to. And there's a second form that's out on the table that I want to bring your attention to, and that is a form if you want to report adverse impacts from high groundwater on your farm, in your basement, in your neighborhood. We're charged by the statute to basically identify where groundwater levels are adversely impacting folks in the basin. We have some sense of that. We're looking at monitoring wells and other ways to determine that. But we're inviting you, and again, opening up the possibility for you to give us that feedback as we go. So here's what we're going to do today. We're going to start off with a welcome from John Stolp, who I think everybody in the room knows, but John is the governor's special advisor for water, and he's going to kind of help get us started. Then we're going to talk a little bit about history, and we're going to use a technique to do that where we more or less get on the same page about how did we get to where we are today. Then I'm going to bring you up to date on how we're approaching House Bill 1278, and I'll tell you it's early. We have mountains of data back in our shop that we're working through, and so we're not going to be looking at the data so much today. What we want to do is have this discussion and this dialogue before we get so far along in the study that we haven't had a chance to consider your input and to consider your thoughts. And so I'll tell you how we're approaching it, as well as I'll bring you up to date on some of the things that DWR and other folks are doing in the South Platte Basin, again, to help us better understand what's happening out there. Then we're going to have an experimental dialogue from a couple of individuals who sit on different parts of the basin, see this a little bit differently, have different feelings about surface and groundwater. Sure, we know it's all one resource, but we tend to extract it differently, and there are different rules in place. So we're going to have a discussion with those two. we hope, to model what civil discourse looks like here. And then we're going to go to your concerns and your issues, the things that you've written down on paper, questions, and things you want us to consider as well. And so that's the approach. The South Platte Roundtable takes up their business at 4 p.m. in this same room. So our hard stop is 3:30. If you have more comments, you'll get a chance to put them on the website and bring those to us. But we'll stop and rearrange the room for the roundtable at 3:30, okay? So without further ado, I want to introduce my friend and our colleague, John Stolt, who is the Governor's Special Advisor for Water. John, thank you.
Thank you, Reagan. Thank you, Reagan. And is this on? Okay. Well, first of all, let me personally thank each and every one of you coming out, and then on behalf of the Governor to also extend his appreciation for the time that many of you are taking out of your busy schedules and could obviously be doing other things to come out and participate in this sort of a forum and discussion about the groundwater issues here in the South Platte. You know, it's interesting that we've come through two rather extraordinary years. In 11, we were extremely wet. In 12, we were extremely dry. And we're starting into 13 with below some of the levels we were at this time a year ago. And so this is not unusual for Colorado, as many of you know, that we have a drought going on in Colorado nearly every year, some year, most years. The issue's been last year and presently every county in the state is under a severe or worse drought declaration or level. And so it just points out to how valuable water resources are in the arid West. And we have done a great service as a society to ourselves and to our fellow human beings on being able to manage water in such a way that we are taking care of 5 million people right now, that we have the prospects of another 5 million coming to be with us. Half of them will be our children and our grandchildren. The other half will be coming because of jobs and opportunity that have brought a number of us to Colorado. And so it's very important that as we kick off this the study on House Bill 1278, that we stop and be appreciative of what's happened in the past. I've found that water folks are extremely creative, and the solutions to the issues that are before us are going to take a lot of creativity, a lot of discussion. As you know, John Hickenlooper was out in Weld County and up and down the Platte several times last year, and as evidenced by this picture, I told Mary Lou the caption there, maybe I ought to just shut up and sit down and you could read it twice and you wouldn't have to listen to me. But I really agree with that last comment that is attributed that smart people willing to compromise can figure this stuff out. And I think that's part of another way of saying we can be creative and we can still be respectful for our prior appropriation system, and any solutions will have to do just that. The governor is a great believer in collaborative and a cooperative approach, and I think most of you in the room have participated in that one way or another. As I look around the room, I see folks from the Water Institute, I see Colorado State University that Reagan also works with, the Water Conservation Board, the Division of Water Resources, and nearly every one of you are part of a water district, irrigation company, or maybe a general farm organization that's been working on these same issues. And so it's important that we put our creative minds together. The governor would say that you need to roll up your sleeves, leave some of your biases at the door, and listen to each other very well. Because I think it's important in any collaborative effort that you listen well, and then you also articulate your issues well too. And I think we'll have opportunity to hear that later this afternoon. And with the study that Reagan and his folks are doing, I've already witnessed a lot of the collaboration of, even though it's an arm's length type of study, the governor's asked that there not be unnecessary duplication of effort, and with the projects bill that has also appropriated money for the South Platte study and analysis, why I think they've worked well to make sure that the different projects you'll hear more about enhance each other and complement each other, And the end product is something that we'll be able to analyze better and hopefully on a common type of platform. And so this is very important that we go into this with an open mind, but it's also important that we work hard at it because time is of the essence. I know Reagan will be giving a number of reports in the coming year to the legislature, to the governor, to other folks, and having a report back to the legislature next December. And this time and day, time really passes quickly, and there's a lot yet to be done. And so thank you again on behalf of the state of Colorado and the governor for your participation in this effort, and we look forward to the outcome.
Thanks, John. Yeah, give him a hand. Thanks, John. Really appreciate you being here. I didn't mention this, but I probably should, and that is that the statute, House Bill 1278, required CSU, the Water Institute, to work independently. And this is an interesting challenge because the state, the division engineer, CWCB, DWR, tremendous amount of work around gathering data, information. The South Platte decision support has been done at the state level. And so we're walking this line of trying to be independent, be collaborative, as well as not duplicate anything. And so it's a dance we're doing, and I really appreciate CWCB and DWR working with us, and John, your office, on trying to find that right spot of independence, yet still not duplicating. So one of the things that we think that we've learned a couple, is that when you look at the history of water use in the South Platte, particularly groundwater, it's important to understand how we got where we are today. It's important not to just think that we can take off and change everything at our whim. We can't look at solutions where a solution helps one part of the basin and hurts another part, or helps one group of users and hurts another. So we found that looking at the history is really important.
The South Platte River and its alluvial aquifer is the scene of a modern-day conundrum. The state legislature wants to know, can we maximize the beneficial use of groundwater while respecting senior surface rights? This brief animation attempts to highlight the events that led us to this place. Before European settlement, the Arapaho and Cheyenne migrated through the South Platte Basin following game. They likely moved on each year when the South Platte's flows disappeared in late summer, and they probably dug into the sandbar aquifers to get cooler and better tasting drinking water. 1860s. Individuals, some of them brought west by the Colorado Gold Rush and the Homestead Act, began growing crops. They dug ditches to divert water directly from the South Platte and its tributaries. In the 1870s, irrigators wanted to irrigate farther from the river, requiring a larger network of ditches. The capital cost was more than one individual could bear. Where did the money come from? Big corporations, some from Europe. One was Travelers Insurance Company. Groups like Greeley's Union Colony, and mutual ditch companies, groups of farmers who got together to pool their resources and labor. 1874. There was an altercation on the Poudre River in which Fort Collins farmers were upbraided by Union Colony farmers because they were taking all the flow of the river. Fort Collins farmers were further upstream, but they didn't get there until after the Union Colony farmers had already dug their ditches. Altercations like this led to the doctrine of prior appropriation. First in time, first in right, regardless of where they are on the river. 1876. Colorado became a state, and the doctrine of prior appropriation was written into its constitution. 1890s. Trans-mountain tunnels were dug to bring water from the Grand River to the Laramie River to bolster the flows of the tributaries of the South Platte. This was before the bigger projects, such as CBT and others, did the same thing in the mid-1900s. The first known irrigation well in the South Platte Basin was drilled in 1886. Mr. Hurdle, east of Eaton, used a centrifugal pump powered by a steam engine to help irrigate his farm. 1893. Mr. Hurdle's neighbor, Mr. McClellan, brought suit against him, charging the well pumping was affecting his ability to get his surface water. The court agreed that a well must not be allowed to injure a senior right, but Mr. McClellan still lost his suit because the court said the evidence of injury was too vague. In the 1900s, Reservoir construction got underway, a means of storing the spring snowmelt flows because otherwise irrigation for the year would be over by early summer. Reservoirs also opened for irrigation a quantity of land on the lower end of the river that previously could not be irrigated reliably. 1922. Professor Ralph Parshall published a study that showed all the surface irrigation on the South Platte was causing two significant changes: more stream flows in the river and an increase in the groundwater table. 1923. Colorado signed an interstate compact with Nebraska, settling conflict over the use of the waters of the South Platte River. By 1930, 300 high-capacity wells were in operation in the South Platte alluvium. In the 1930s, the drought was the impetus for 1,400 more high-capacity wells. 1940s. Wells really took off in the South Platte Basin because of two developments: the advent of rural electrification and the invention of the turbine pump. 1950s. Another drought spurred the move towards even more wells being drilled on the South Platte. Drought brought low stream flows. Surface water irrigators and reservoir owners with water rights dating back to the late 1800s and early 1900s began to notice that they didn't have enough water to irrigate, while their neighbors with wells could irrigate. Some became suspicious that wells were drawing water away from the stream. 1956. Ralph Parshall pointed out things that had dramatically changed on the South Platte. He said all the irrigation wells installed in the 30 years since his 1922 study were using up the seepage return flow that earlier had benefited the senior direct flow and reservoir shortage rights downstream. 1957. In a response to complaints about wells taking water away from senior surface users, the Colorado State Legislature passed the Colorado Groundwater Law of 1957. This replaced their first attempt at regulating tributary groundwater in 1953. Now you had to get a well permit from the state in order to drill a well, but the permit didn't give you the right to use the water. For that, you had to take your permit along with the evidence of when you first drilled your well, and you could get a water right with that priority date. 1965. The legislature passed the Colorado Groundwater Management Act, which gave the state engineer authority to deny a well permit application if there was no unappropriated water or if the proposed well would injure existing water rights. 1967. The legislature authorized a 2-year study to find out if legislation was needed to bring groundwater into the prior appropriation system. 1968. Mort Bittinger and Ken Wright conducted the study. They found that the South Platte groundwater reservoir contained about 10 million acre-feet of water, but it was being utilized in only a haphazard and unplanned way. They said that the distribution of the water in the aquifer was a problem, not the amount of water. They also found that while groundwater pumping was causing some infringement on senior rights, it was not as severe as some had thought. They pointed out that groundwater pumping was actually helping stabilize water supplies in the South Platte Basin. While it is important to recognize vested water rights on surface diverters, they said, it is also important to efficiently manage the whole water resource, both surface water and groundwater. Also in 1968, the case of Fellhauer versus the People came before the Colorado Supreme Court. It ruled that the state had to come up with orderly rules and regulations regarding groundwater. It couldn't just arbitrarily shut off wells to provide more water for surface users. Justice Groves brought up a new concept. He said that while it is important that we prevent injury to senior water rights, we have to also integrate into the law the concept of maximum beneficial use. 1969. A big year for groundwater in Colorado. The legislature passed an act called the Colorado Water Right Determination and Administration Act. It is often referred to as simply the 1969 Act. In a nutshell, this act said a well user could pump water out of priority, but only if he prevented injury to water right owners senior to him by replacing depletions in time, location, and amount. The means of replacing that water became known as augmentation. The legislation required well users to submit augmentation plans to be adjudicated by the courts. In the 1970s and 80s, well pumpers began to submit augmentation plans. For instance, in 1972, several augmentation plans in the Fort Morgan area were adjudicated, but many others operated under substitute water supply plans that the state engineer allowed. The state's engineer's right to approve these temporary plans was the subject of legislation in 1974 and 1977, and became a major issue, as we will see later. 2 organizations formed to help well users in the South Platte meet the new requirements. One was called GASP, Groundwater Appropriators of the South Platte. The other was formed by the Central Colorado Water Conservancy District on behalf of its members. It was called Central GMS, Groundwater Management Subdistrict. Both of these organizations collected dues from their members and began to find augmentation water. In some cases, they bought permanent supplies, but because it was so expensive, they often leased water from those who had excess. There was an excess of water to lease because these were unusually wet years. During this time, GASP and Central GMS operated under temporary substitute water supply plans. And then, the perfect storm. 2 major events happened to turn things around big time. 2001. The first event was the Empire Lodge case. Water was a side issue in the case, but it led to a Supreme Court ruling that said the state engineer did not have the authority to issue temporary substitute water supply plans indefinitely. Well owners must, as originally required in the 1969 Act, file for formally adjudicated augmentation plans in order to continue the operation of the wells. 2002. The second event was drought. Big time. The biggest drought since the 1930s. Senior surface water users kept a call on the river almost constantly in 2002, 2003, and 2004, but still received very diminished supplies. GASP and Central GMS couldn't keep up with their members' commitments because the availability of lease water virtually disappeared. The perfect storm created by these 2 events, the major drought and the Empire Lodge case, resulted in tremendous upheaval on the South Platte River. Many who had relied on use of their wells to irrigate crops were prevented from doing so. The ensuing conflict led to attempts to give relief to well users while protecting the rights of senior surface users. Legislation gave well users additional time to get into compliance, but the lack and expense of available augmentation supplies was a huge detriment to the continued operation of a number of wells. Protests mounted, including a big meeting in 2006 that brought Governor Ritter to Wiggins to listen to angry well users. In 2007, Governor Ritter convened a neutral South Platte Wells task force to listen to testimony and see if they could come up with any solutions. Some testified that senior surface rights must be protected at all costs. Others argued that the level of augmentation required under the new rules was too severe and that shutting off wells was damaging the state's economy. This polarized debate led to little change, but the task force did make 10 recommendations. 2 of the recommendations were eventually adopted: streamlining of the water court to improve efficiency and forgiveness of current depletions caused by pre-1974 pumping. Now we are in what we would call the full augmentation era. Though approximately 1,200 wells remain partially or fully curtailed, many well users have found supplies to fully augment the groundwater use. One way is by purchasing surface water rights to flow into the river directly. Another way is to build recharge projects. These are engineered to deliver water in a manner that replicates the time, place, and volume it would have originally reached the river. A significant number of reports have been made of high groundwater levels causing flooding basements and crop damage. Many believe this to be caused by excessive augmentation of the aquifer and lack of groundwater pumping. Others believe it has more to do with the high water years we have had, or that people are building new structures in areas with naturally high water tables. 2012. The state legislature approved HB 1278, funding the Colorado Water Institute at CSU to do a study of the situation. This is the first major study of the South Platte River and its alluvium since the study that led to the 1969 Act that brought wells into the prior appropriation system. What does the legislature want this new study to find out? First is the cause of high water tables over augmentation, and if so, what is the remedy? But perhaps more important, what can we learn from the past 45 years since we passed the 1969 Act? Is it possible that we could be employing new technologies and knowledge to manage groundwater and surface water in a way that is beneficial to both senior surface users and well pumpers? Are our rules keeping us from using improved operation and management tools that we didn't know about when those rules were passed? Preventing injury to private property rights is critical. But could we meet the dual goals of maximizing the economic beneficial use of the whole water resource while still protecting water rights from injury? Those are tough questions, but CSU is hard at work trying to find the answers. Their report is due to the legislature by December 31st, 2013.
Okay. Thank you. Mary Lou and Noah put this together. If anybody has comments, I mean, they literally just got it done, I think, yesterday. And so if you think we missed something, yeah, give her a hand. I thought she did good. Do I have a clicker? John, do I have a clicker for the slides? Do I have a clicker to advance the slides or not? No? Okay, you're going to have to do it for me. Can you go ahead and pull up my slides, John, and let's do that. So I thought I'd stand up here by the slides just to make it easier. So again, if you have a comment about that, we tried our best to make that a balanced animation, and be looking forward to your thoughts about it. Is that going to do anything for me?
I think so.
I'll tell you what I'll do. Yeah, I'll just punch it, and then you'll know I'm ready for you to advance it. How about that? When I go like that, that means advance the slides. Okay, so you know, when I've done talks about where we're going on 1278 previously, I've spent a lot of time on that history because I do think it's really important for us to be at the same place, to understand 150 years of trying to work this out on the river and to maximize this resource. So now I get to skip that thanks to the animation. Thank you for that, Mary Lou. Click. So what I really wanted to do was to take 15 or 20 minutes and just tell you all how we're approaching 1278, what we're doing, and then hopefully that'll inform you as you think about the comments that you want to make later and the feedback that you want to give to myself and the study team. But I think as I look in this room, maybe there's a few people who weren't engaged in the session last year when we were debating 1278. But as I look, I see many people in this room who took part in that history. And we were making water history. We always are here in Colorado. But as you know, Representative Fisher and Senator Renfro sponsored a bill to begin to look at some of the issues in the South Platte, particularly in response to high groundwater levels. There were homeowners, stakeholders, farmers, et cetera, that were really being physically impacted by high groundwater levels, and they wanted some relief. They wanted to understand what was going on and how can they get this water out of their fields or out of their basement. And I think that was the original impetus for House Bill 1278. And as it ended up, I count 37. You were a little fast there, John, but that was good. I liked it. That'll keep me moving as well. There were 37 members of the Colorado legislature that signed on to 1278. I believe that's the number. So over a third of the legislature ended up signing on to the act. And really what persisted in the act was a call for a study of groundwater in the South Platte Basin. And so there were 7 objectives that the bill called for. And I'll just go ahead and let you know what those are. So as you think about what you want to tell us, you can reflect on those. First objective is huge. It's overriding, and you saw it in the video, and that is to evaluate whether or not the way that we are currently administering the surface and groundwater in the basin is, in fact, maximizing beneficial use and protecting senior water rights. This dichotomy that was set up in the Fellhauer case. Secondly, to identify these areas that are adversely impacted by high groundwater levels. I'll say a little bit more about that, but again, I'll point out to you that there's a form that we have out there on the table and that's in the back of the room. We want to identify these areas. We've been charged by the legislature by doing so, and so we're going to do all the diligence that we can to try to find those areas. And what you'll see as we go along is there's some complexities to that. What is high groundwater? What would you like to call it? 10 feet below surface, 5 feet, 1 foot, what is it? And so it's not quite as straightforward as it might seem. Then thirdly, to provide information to mitigate adverse impacts in those areas that are experiencing high groundwater levels. This also is an interesting challenge because it may be that different areas are having high groundwater for different reasons, and we'll have to sort that out and think through it. And then finally, to provide information to the General Assembly to facilitate the long-term, sustainable use of South Platte water. Notice it didn't say maximum, it said sustainable. And this is a really interesting trend, I think, in Colorado water law, this idea of moving from maximal to optimal to sustainable. And we're seeing this down the San Luis Valley and other places where I think, in a sense, the paradigm is shifting. Click. And the bill also required us to do 3 other things, to evaluate to what extent augmentation plans are preventing injury, to other water rights holders or potentially causing over-augmentation of well depletions. Basically look at what we're doing on augmentation out there. This is a huge challenge, as those of you who know, who have gotten into any of these augmentation plans. Not simple at all. Item I, the double I there, whether additional usage of the alluvial aquifer could be permitted in a manner consisting with protecting senior surface rights or senior water rights. So of that 10 million acre feet or whatever the right number is, right now it looks like we're using, best I can tell, somewhere between 400 and 500,000 acre feet of groundwater in the basin. I don't know if Brent has a better number, but it's somewhere in that ballpark. So we're using, what, 4 to 5% of what's out there. Obviously, you can't use it all. The question is, can we use more? That's the way I see that. And then to what extent the use of water in the basin could be improved by affording the state engineer additional authority to administer water right. This issue of flexibility. Have we created enough flexibility in water management? And so these are the charges of House Bill 1278. We got underway around the 1st of September of this last year. We've been deep in the data since then. Click, John. And it's a huge task. And what I want to do is to come back to you all in a few months and maybe come back to you all a couple of times over the next 4 to 6 months and begin to look at data with you. We're really not going to do that today. I want to just set the course today and hear from you. But you know, this first slide is showing the amount of high-capacity wells out in the South Platte, and it's also showing the curtailed wells that we've been able to ascertain from the records. And there's a lot of well pumping going on out there, right? There's a lot happening out in the basin. The exact numbers we're zeroing in on, but you know, at one time there were some 8,800 wells out there. There are still several thousands of wells pumping out in the South Platte. In fact, the number curtailed, we're sort of necking down that number now and trying to get a better handle on how many wells are curtailed because of what's transpired in the last decade. And the impacts are there for sure. There are economic impacts. And one of the things that we'll talk about that, I think, when we have our panel discussion a little bit later. And then the augmentation plans. And so the South Platte is pretty well covered by a lot of augmentation plans. Was everybody able to get in? Was everybody able to get covered in a way that they could afford to? No. And some of you all that are out there are living that right now. And it came down to money, didn't it? It came down to how expensive it was late in the game to get under a plan. This is a graphic put together by the division engineer. I'm not sure exactly who put it together, but it's really looking at sort of the history of recharge going back to the late 70s. And I don't know how well you can see this in the back of the room. I don't have a pointer here. But essentially what you see is that, and you'll hear me refer to District 1, 2, and 64, and I think most people in this room know what those are, but this graphic is broken out. The red line is total, blue line is District 1, very bottom line is 2, and that's 64. And you can see, if you can't read that, you know, there was a general upward trend of augmentation out there in the basin, but it wasn't until the 2000s that augmentation levels really came up out there in the South Platte. They had to, right? That's what was required to be done in order to pump these wells and to continue to grow the crops that folks needed to grow and do the things they needed to do. Go ahead. Click. Okay. So fast forward like the video showed, and what became clear starting in 2008, but really in 2009, 10, and 11, were these areas with serious complaints, numerous complaints of high groundwater levels. And the one in the Sterling area out in District 64, and then of course in District 2 down there south of Greeley. Two different areas. And if you remember the chart I just showed you, the amount of augmentation is different there, the amount of wells, there's a lot of differences between these two areas. The commonality was that they were seeing high groundwater. Interestingly, the lower river in 10 and 11, there was a lot of precipitation. 9, 10, and 11 were very wet years down the lower river. In Weld County, precipitation was about average. But remember, 9, 10, and 11 were good snowpack years, right? So we had more diversions coming off. We had irrigation ditches fuller, perhaps, than average. So although it was average to dry in Weld County, we had good water years there. So it's part of what we're charged with sorting out. And are these the only areas in the basin? Is this the beginning of a trend towards higher groundwater levels? Are we at the end of something that just, was it a blip in time? This, I think, is a really interesting challenge for us to try to ascertain is where we're going on these problems in the basin. Thanks, John. So we really want to look at this issue of groundwater depth, and this is not easy to do. The particular chart that is shown there, the red areas on the map are where you're 10 feet or less, groundwater is 10 feet or less from the surface. And this is data that we were able to pull out of the South Platte Decision Support System and create this map. We've got to do better than this, and we have to get a finer touch on this really in order to understand cause and effect than what's in this map. And so, click, John. A lot of that's where 1278 is going. And so you saw the scope of the bill, the charge under the bill is really wide look at whether or not we're maximizing water use in the basin. Can we have more wells on? Are we over augmenting? But clearly we have to address this groundwater issue. And so the way that we're approaching this is very much in a data-driven exercise. We were not given the time, the funding, or the flexibility to develop a new model. And it would be very questionable to do so given the amount of effort that's been placed into the South Platte Decision Support. Our goal is to work with the South Platte Decision Support, particularly the data tools, the TS tools, to pull down information that the state's already put up there and begin to analyze this in a way that hasn't been looked at before and that is comprehensive for the entire basin. And so the scope of work for 1278, really we break it down into 4 tasks. And because of the time frame that we're working with, we're running all 4 of these tasks simultaneously, right? We don't have time to do them sequentially. I wish we did. But there's folks out there that want answers, and they need answers sooner rather than later. And so what we're doing is working very hard on this data collection and display. We're doing the groundwater mapping. I'll say more about that in a minute. Evaluating all of the data, trying to figure out how to automate these data pulls, make it so that other scientists and engineers in the basin, it'll be easier for them to ask some of these same sort of questions and look at it from their perspective. And then this idea of stakeholder involvement. I think this was something that wasn't specifically written into the final bill, but our feeling was, and what we scoped with CWCB, was that if we don't work to some shared solutions, we're probably not going to get there, right? We can't sacrifice one person's resource or one person's economic value at the expense of somebody else's. And so we've got to find things that are going to work upstream, downstream, surface water, groundwater. That's a very tall order. We feel like the only way we get there is through dialogue and discussion, and we want to do that as we go along here and take that forward in our report to the legislature. So our project team, I'm not going to name everybody that's on the project team, but what I want to mention to you is a couple of things, and that is that part of what we've done is to create, I'd say, a little bit more rigorous approach, and almost, it's not quite duplicative, but a dual approach on looking at what's happening to groundwater levels. We've contracted with USGS to work alongside us, but again, a bit independently. So we've got a group at CSU that's working through the data. USGS is taking that same data, and they're going to be working on it as well. We've got Riverside Technologies involved. Colorado Climate Center is going to be pulling down all of the climate layers for the South Platte for us, and we're starting to put those together, as well as Dick Stenzel from Applegate Group and others. We've got a number of people that are trying to help us work through this as expeditiously as we can. And then I doubt that you can see that back there, but so just forget about what it says. These are the data layers that we're working through right now, and I'll say more about them in a second, but there is a tremendous amount of data for us to look at. And you know, how far back do we go? Shall we go back to the 1890s, the 1950s? Where shall we go? And that's part of what we are trying to sort out. The data layers don't all match up, right? The well data is different from the surface water data, that's different from the climate data, that's different from groundwater data. And trying to figure out how you bring those together is our unique challenge. I'm going to click again. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, John. I'm running out of time. But one of the things that's probably most important to our study is a real live look at the data around what's happening at groundwater levels. And so what we've got to work with is a series of groundwater monitoring wells that are out there in the basin. This is a map of those wells. I don't know if you can see all these yellow wells over here in the central district. We've got the USGS wells. We've got the so-called CSU wells. We've got Lowers wells, Julesburg wells. And so we've got about 350 to 60 data points out there that have long-term records. And by long-term, some of them going back to the 20s and 30s and 40s, most of them the last 20 years or so. But we've got a good record, and the challenge, of course, is making sense of all that. I mean, here's the record for just one well. The map shows this is in the Peckham area. You know, we've got the data. You can see how it plots out, and, you know, it's jicking along there. There it hits 2004, and wham, up it goes. Look at another well that's in... Looks like it's north of Wiggins out there, and this is a really long, this is going back to 47, and you can see a long history of just sort of steady declines. You hit 2005, 6, somewhere in there, up she starts to come. Here's a well north of Fort Lupton. What you see on this is an irrigation well. Well, it just kind of hangs around 20 feet, and so we've got 360 of these that we are trying to sort through temporally, spatially. They're not all sampled at the same time. We know that there's seasonal and diurnal variations. And so a lot of our initial data collection and analysis efforts are really on sorting out these groundwater monitoring wells, going through them line by line, looking at the data, trying to take out or find the bad points, make sure we have good wells, good data, we know what we're looking at, and then begin to group these and look at them spatially, and then see what tools we might be able to use to understand what's happening. So the other thing that I want to point out to you that we put into place on the 1278 study is a completely independent scientific review panel. And the idea behind that is while CSU and USGS and Riverside are working together to sort through this data, we want some people out there at an arm's length from us that we'll bring it to, and they will essentially peer review the way that we're going forward here. And if we're not looking at the data in a way that is scientifically correct or can be substantiated, they're going to call us out on it. And so we created another kind of a layer to look over our shoulders and make sure that we're doing things right. And then I think probably another point that's really important, and we didn't create time in today's meeting to talk about all of this, but at the same time that the 1278 study is going forward, there are a number of concurrent projects that are going to be bringing information to bear on it. And probably the two most important I need to mention is in those two wet areas, in the Sterling area and in the Gilchrist area, there's two pilot projects going on that DWR is in charge of. And these, some of you remember, were written into the projects bill. And the idea is, we're looking at the basin writ large. Let's get down to these two areas and look at them in real detail and see if we can figure out in these small areas what's going on geologically, what's going on with recharge, what's going on with groundwater levels. And so those are being instrumented to some great detail, a much finer grid than what's happening over the whole basin. The projects bill also created some funding to update the South Platte decision support. So that tool, do I wish I had that today? Of course we do. We're ready for the DSS, and it's coming out, and CSU is working on the model, but there's some updating that's going on as well right now to bring the data in the DSS from 2006 to the present. In addition, CSU is evaluating the DSS groundwater model, and whether or not we'll be able to use that in conducting 1278, I think is somewhat unlikely given the time frame. We'd like to use it. We will use it eventually, and the question is, how does it help us to sort through these questions? And then there are other monitoring wells that are being installed out there in the basin, and instrumented as well. So that's the approach that we're using. In a perfect world, we'd have our groundwater and our surface water model. We'd had all the data reconciled, and this would be a different task than we're undertaking. But it is what it is, and we're moving forward with both the analysis as well as trying to understand what can we do about it. So that's why you all are here today, to help us think through that as well. We have a website. I think it's mentioned on the fact sheet that Mary Lou passed out. We're going to be hosting our information about meetings, documentation, data as we create data layers. Those are QA'd and QC'd and ready for release. They'll be put up there as well. Our plan is to share all of our data with you all. Okay, to have it all laid out there. And we're trying to lay down these layers that we understand what they say, what they mean, where the data came from, and make those available. And will we end up arguing about them? Sure. I mean, let's do that. That's how you push forward the process in terms of understanding science and engineering. You got to lay it out and then begin the discussion. Obviously, there's a huge legal and institutional part of this as well, right? It's not all just science and engineering. That's an interesting part that I think we'll have to address at some phase in 1278. I'd like to get a little bit further in terms of analyzing the data, have more data to put on the table. And so I'm hoping if things go well in a couple of months, we'll be able to come back to this same group and begin to look at those groundwater monitoring levels on those 300 wells, look at the diversion numbers, look at the recharge data, et cetera, as well as the geology. And part of what's happening in those pilot areas is the geology of those two areas is getting looked at in much greater detail. They're different. They're not the same. They're not the same in terms of the way water's being used there, the way the geology is, the way the climate is, or has been over the last couple of years. And so we want to be careful about overgeneralizing what's happening as well as overgeneralizing solutions. But it may be that local solutions will be best. It may be that there are things we can do at the state level. We shall see. But that's the approach that we're taking. I think the plan now is we're going to have a quick break. We're going to set up the chairs. We're going to bring Robert Cicada and Joe Frank up and have a dialogue with Mary Lou and I and you all, and then we will begin the open discussion format. So shall we take 5 or 6 minutes? You want to take 10? 10 minutes.
Lemonade.
10 and lemonade. And again, if anybody wants to comment to me about what I've presented thus far, I'm absolutely interested, and we want to hear that as well. If you'll write it down, the advantage is it'll get up on the website and it'll be recorded. And so I would ask that you write it down. I think that would be perfect. So thank you all for your attention. Let's take a 10-minute break, lemonade in the back, and then we'll begin the dialogue.